Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Charlotte Duran. I'm a producer here at KPCC. For those of you who are unfamiliar with KPCC, we are a multi-platform organization. We're on the air at 89.3. We're online at kpcc.org, and we're in person. We do lots of events throughout the community, throughout Southern California, and at our Crawford Family Forum in Pasadena. If you want to learn more about the events that we have, like the one tonight, check us out, kpcc.org/in-person. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are live video streaming tonight, so we ask that you turn the flash off your cameras. But feel free, take photos, connect with us on social. You can connect with us at KPCC in person. The hashtag we're using tonight is Officer Involved. So I hope you enjoy, and now I'd like to introduce tonight's host, KPCC's Annie Gilbertson.
Hi, thanks so much for coming, y'all. So we started looking at police use of force in San Bernardino County, and it's actually really hard to get a lot of information about police use of force. So the first part of this program, we're going to talk a little bit about what we found and some of the staggering statistics surrounding lethal force and people that showed signs of substance use. But what I'd really like to get at in this conversation is what is the ideal here? What are some of the solutions when we talk about policing drug use in our communities? Because I think everybody wants the same thing. I mean, use of force, of course, is such a divisive issue, but in reality, I think that community members, police, families of individuals who have gone through use of force incidents agree that we need safe streets. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like, especially in the backdrop of California's changing drug laws. But first, we're going to talk to my reporting partner, Beatriz Valenzuela, with the San Bernardino Sun. She is a crime and safety reporter. You can come up, Beatriz. Yeah. Got fans. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the reporting that we've done that really brought this issue to light for us. So a little bit of background on our reporting, and this is going to be kind of more of a conversation between us and you guys because we co-reported this, so I may be jumping in here and there in addition to asking questions. So we, our newsrooms, we teamed up on some police reporting in San Bernardino County. Let's start with the findings. I mentioned this finding surrounding people that showed signs of substance use. Can you talk a little bit more about what we saw?
Well, to give a little background, what we did is we reached out to the DA's office, who gave us information on the cleared cases. So this isn't to say that these were all the officer-involved shootings or use of force, and we did have some criteria of that, but we took the numbers from 2010 to 2015, and those are the numbers that were the cases that we were reporting on. What we found was that in 70% of the cases, there was some sort of impairment that was found, and that was higher than in LA County because KPCC...
It was like more than double LA County.
Right, yeah. And KPCC had done a previous project where they looked at LA County's use of force, officer-involved shootings in particular. So that was one of the big takeaways from the project.
Yeah, and we had also looked at other research that had been done around the country. There's not a ton of research around, suspects that are shot that show signs of substance use, but there was a 8-city study, and it showed that, it was around 50% of people that officers engaged in force with showed some kind of substance use signs. So that'd be alcohol, marijuana, illegal drugs such as methamphetamine, which were the ones we commonly saw, right?
Right. For San Bernardino County, what we saw is, and I'll have to take a look, the top drug that was present was alcohol, followed by methamphetamine, amphetamines, and then marijuana. So those were the top 4, but alcohol being the most prevalent amongst the people who were shot within that time frame.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I mean, off the bat, you know, methamphetamine was high too, and I know you've covered this issue here in San Bernardino County. And did you have initial questions going into this reporting that, you know, we may be seeing high numbers of use of force because of substance use trends within San Bernardino County?
Well, in doing some of the research, I did speak to a couple of experts talking about drugs. And as a matter of fact, I think you did the same thing. We spoke to experts and we asked them why. You know, why are we seeing these numbers? And a lot of people just said that they weren't sure. They did not know why. One of the problems is that it's really difficult to gauge how much drug use is going on.
Yeah, because it's illegal oftentimes, right?
Right, and just depending, you could do drugs in your house and that would never get reported. It was very difficult. So the numbers that we ended up going with was from the Department of Behavioral Health here in the county, and that was based on people who get help. So people who go into treatment and the kinds of drugs that they were using. And the numbers that we got was that on average every year the Department of Mental Health sees 60,000 unduplicated clients a year. So that's a lot, but pardon me. One of the other issues is that there appears to be a lot of crossover as well with mental health.
Right, yeah, the co-occurring issues with mental health. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was going to add to that, so some of the initial, when, you know, we published this reporting that showed 70% of people shot in San Bernardino County, all law enforcement agencies, the sheriff's department being the biggest, showed signs of substance use, right? And so the initial question we got pushback a lot on was, you know, well, we know that there are substance abuse problems in San Bernardino County. Well, I'm here to tell you that also exists in LA County. It also exists in Orange County. And we checked the public health data of what was available. And, you know, they use, public health uses overdose numbers. And actually what we saw in those trends is that it was very similar across counties. So for some reason, we were still seeing these high numbers of lethal force, this high rate of lethal force in San Bernardino County with drug users. And I mean, it really intrigued us to the point where we had to keep reporting. So as the reporting continued, you know, what did people say were some of the reasons why we might be seeing these figures?
One thing that people did say to me is that it could be the type of drugs that we are seeing being used in San Bernardino County. As I noted, that most of them were alcohol and methamphetamines. And actually speaking to one of the experts, he said that alcohol and meth tends to be a more, generally speaking, people who are using those drugs tend to be more violent as opposed to marijuana or opiates. So could that be it? I don't know. Because the numbers are very difficult to track. You can't tell if there's going to be more of this or more of that. The one thing that the Department of Health did say is that the leading drug that they do treat for here in San Bernardino County has been meth for several years. So methamphetamine is one of the drugs.
Just put your microphone a little closer.
So that could be it. Maybe there's just more meth use here. But unfortunately, there isn't any real hard data except that the Department of Mental Health they're treating more people with that type of substance abuse.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the experts we talked to too, it was just such a myriad of issues really at play. And we'll drill down a little bit on what some of the experts thought. But I thought we'd get into the story of Catherine Wan, who you had interviewed. Talk to me about how you found her.
Facebook. So I did
That's how we find everybody.
I did a search for Timothy Wan, who was the young man who was shot, and I found his mother, and I reached out to her, and she was willing to talk. She hadn't spoken about this case before, at least that I could tell. She said she hadn't.
Her son was shot by police.
Her son was shot by police. He did die. In talking to her, and the story that she and her attorney had relayed to me was that her son did have substance abuse issues. She knew that, the family knew that. As a matter of fact, when she called the night of the incident, she called to say that her son most likely was on drugs. He was acting erratically and she needed help.
So we have some of the tape from her. So let's have her tell her story. So you'll hear a little bit of the radio story that we had eventually put together out of this reporting. I'm going to play host here and read into it. Catherine Wan noticed her 23-year-old son was acting strangely. Worried, she dialed 911.
He thought people were chasing him, and he was very scared, and, I needed help.
That was the day her son died.
It was August 2012, a Monday morning. Catherine Wan opened her door to a San Bernardino sheriff's deputy. She felt relieved talking to him. This was a routine call. He would go get Ted, and everything would be fine.
And I can't get it out of my head when he was leaving my house, and I almost said to him, please don't hurt him. And I thought, he was so calm and it seemed like he was so understanding that I didn't even need to say that, because he's not going to hurt him.
But Ted wasn't cooperating. He ran into a nearby yard in this rural neighborhood and slipped into a hay shed made from a shipping container.
It wasn't a big long one like you see off of a train, but it was a smaller version.
Wan still can't believe how drugs had taken over her son. After high school, Ted had become an EMT and saved a man's life. Now he was using heroin. She was afraid he'd die of an overdose.
I knew that there was going to be a big problem coming.
That Monday morning, she thought maybe he's hit rock bottom, and this arrest will turn his life around. Records show Deputy Mark Beitler found Ted hiding in the shed and stepped inside. Then a neighbor heard a man yell, "Help," and a smattering of gunshots. 5 bullets tore through Ted, his hand, his shoulder, his chest, the top of his head. When Beitler emerged from the shed and into daylight, his uniform was dirtied, his name tag unhinged. Wan couldn't believe what happened.
He was locked in a shed. They had him.
Neither Beitler nor the sheriff's department would talk about the case. Records show Beitler told investigators Ted pushed him and threatened him with a shovel. The deputy punched him several times in the head and hit him with a steel baton. Beitler was treated for minor cuts and bruises. Ted's mother wonders, what if the deputy had just waited outside the shed for Ted to calm down?
There was no emergency. And to take someone's life like that is just wrong.
Tape from some of the reporting we did. You got a little bit of the narrative of what happened to Catherine Wan's son, and a little bit of the deputy's perspective. So she said something interesting at the end there, Beatriz. She said, what if he had just waited? Had you explored sort of this as really a tactic that could be part of the solutions here in talking about limiting lethal force with people that show signs of substance use?
I know that in speaking to Wan and also speaking to her attorney, they definitely felt that could have been something that could have helped if the deputy would have waited for backup, if there would have been if they would have maybe stepped back and given him the opportunity to
Calm
wait,
down
to
was
calm down.
her words.
His mother also said that if they would have gone to go get her, maybe that could have helped in the situation. So there has been some talk of that, of maybe waiting could have helped that situation.
Yeah. And what really struck out to me about, when she was talking about this is, that's a lot of the same strategies we've heard through dealing with people in mental health crisis, right? So a lot of attention's been paid to lethal force with people with mental health issues. And, advocates for people that are experiencing problematic substance use say, just as we're rethinking how to approach people in mental health crisis, we need to rethink how to approach people that might be suffering from a drug crisis. And the time and distance that you just described. There was this other incident that we looked at we'll get to this really quickly, involving a woman, Penny Trent. Can you talk a little bit about her story?
I'm not as familiar with the Penny Trent story as I am with Theodore Wan's story, but I know that deputies were called to her home, and she was sitting on a couch. She was on prescription medication, I believe is what
Yeah, it was
she was on.
Oxycontin.
Oxycontin, and her demeanor changed according to the deputy testimony, and I think that's what initially led to the officer-involved shooting in that case. But I believe that maybe you might have a little more background.
I know, I
on
set her
that.
up for that because I was really the one that reported out that story. So this woman, Penny Trent, this story also struck us, and I'm just trying to give you guys sort of like a myriad of the examples we saw when we looked at use of force cases here. And the issue with Penny Trent was it was a domestic violence call, right? She was a suspected victim in this case, and the deputies responded. They arrested the husband, but when the Deputy Chadwell, a sheriff's deputy, went back into the house, she couldn't see Penny's hands, and she got startled. She thought Penny was gonna maybe had a weapon, she said, and she shot. And this was a domestic violence victim. And so what I talked to her lawyer about that I thought was really interesting was, when did the drug use come into play? And he said, this really got drawn out in the investigation, right? So every police shooting has an investigation that starts right after the shooting incident is called in. Homicide detectives go out, the DA reviews it. And in this case, these homicide detectives really zeroed in on her drug use and took the prescription pills as evidence, asked her about her prescription pill use. And what her lawyer said was, he felt like the sheriff's investigators were looking for dirt on her. That, to paint someone as a drug user would help justify the use of force. So that was also part of our reporting, and something that we considered sort of like, why are we seeing such high rates of substance use indicated in these files, and is that at play? So that was one of the questions that we had. I think we should get to the next guest. Beatriz, thanks so much. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna bring each guest up one by one and bring them all back up at the end. So thank you so much. Our next guest is Eunices Hernandez. She's a policy coordinator with the Drug Policy Alliance. Thanks so much. Yes, you can clap. Yes. So, and like I said, the backdrop of this conversation was this reporting that we did on lethal force. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of the use of force issues within policing drug users. But, why I wanted to go to you next is because, the real context here is how, is this conversation about how police interact with drug users and how we all kind of perceive drug users. And talking to you before this event, it was all really it's all really began with the war on drugs. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how that changed America's perception of drug users?
Sure. So the war on drugs did two things. It changed how people perceive drug users, but it also created a mechanism that incentivized the arrest, incarceration, and persecution of people who use drugs. It created a system that incentivized law enforcement to go after those offenses because they could get federal funding to do those things. But the war on drugs demonized and stigmatized folks who use drugs, regardless of the drugs. But we see that a lot of the policies that have come out of the war on drugs, for example, crack cocaine, folks who got caught with crack would oftentimes face a penalty up to 18 times harsher than if a person who had cocaine, even though essentially the drug is the same. But historically, crack has been associated with low-income Black neighborhoods, and these folks have been demonized for that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it wasn't applied evenly across
Definitely not.
types of communities.
No.
So was it politically advantageous for some? I mean, why police some communities differently than others?
Well, I think that we have to look at the root causes of the war on drugs and how it started. we can go back to Nixon's quote about how a lot of the origins of the policies were based to suppress certain communities. We can look back when marijuana became illegal, how it was associated with the Mexican labor workers that were coming about, and it was a mechanism for that community to be suppressed. With crack cocaine, the same thing. We saw black neighborhoods being over-policed for the same drug that was called cocaine in other neighborhoods. But you didn't see the same amount of arrests or persecution in those neighborhoods. And we see across the spectrum that black, white, and Latino communities use and sell drugs around the same rates, but it's our prisons and jails that are filled with black and brown bodies.
Yeah. So in talking to you, clearly there was this campaign to criminalize drug use for the last, 50 years or something, and some of the ideas is that it was really going to make America's neighborhoods safer, right? Because our kids wouldn't be exposed to drugs, we'd be getting drugs off the streets, and that was politically popular, right? So, I mean, did it work, right? Did we have less drugs?
It's still pretty popular, but no, it hasn't worked at all. We've seen that for 40 years, those policies have only led to the incarceration of generations of our communities, but it hasn't, one, reduced the availability of drugs within our communities, or two, made our communities safer. You can still, because there's no regulation of any drugs, you can go to any neighborhood and find marijuana or any illicit drug because it's still in an underground market.
So the history of policing drug use is clear with this, America's war on drugs, right? And sending people to prison for drug possession, still happens in many states. And do you think that partially, I was just talking to Beatriz about the use of force we saw among drug users. Do you think that this police's their historical approach to drug use is part of the reason why we're seeing use of force, or why do you think that we're seeing such a high rate of use of force among drug users?
I think, one, we haven't created a social safety net so that these folks have a place to go other than into the criminal justice system. For example, Ted's mom, what if she had another agency she could call to help deal with this crisis? That doesn't really exist in any of our communities. And so because there is a lack of social safety net, it's been easy to kind of filter these people into the criminal justice system and have law enforcement at the front end of this. Because when we think about safety, we think about 911, and who comes when we call 911? The police do. So we really have to take a step back and reimagine what safety looks like in our communities, because it hasn't really been law enforcement to, how do I say this, spread safety at all levels for all types of things, especially for people who use drugs. Law enforcement is trained to do one thing, to keep our communities safe. We haven't really invested in adding other people to that unit that are trained in like mental health crises. You talked about people who use substances and having co-occurring disorders. Like that's not questioned at all. We know that a lot of folks who have problematic substance use, who are using drugs, have a mental health issue that hasn't been dealt with, or they don't have access to those types of services that can help them deal with those kinds of issues.
So Aonesis is also clearly an advocate for like decriminalization of drugs, right? I mean, that's a correct characterization. And so as many of you probably know, California's laws have been changing, pretty substantially in recent years, and just very recently. So talk to me a little bit about sort of what changes we've seen and how you think that is changing the conversation.
So in the last several years, California, well, let's go back a little bit. For the last 40 years, California has implemented like these tough on crime policies to kind of push the war on drugs. But in the last, I would say 10 years, we've seen that California is now leading the nation in developing reforms that, one, have gotten people out of prison and jail, and have ended the criminalization of certain types of drugs and drug use. And for example, we had Prop 36, which was a 3 strikes law. Then the second Prop 36 that allowed people to get diverted into treatment. We've seen Prop 47 that passed in 2014 that California voters passed that reduced 6 felonies down to misdemeanors moving forward and retroactively.
Including drug possession.
Including, all drug possession, so of meth, marijuana, narcotics, and also certain property crimes.
Talk to me, just so people aren't maybe familiar with sort of the legal system of like felony and misdemeanor, so what did that mean in sort of tangible terms?
Great. So a person that got a felony, they do prison time, but because of realignment that happened in 2010, which shifted certain prisoners down to county jail time, certain felonies are now served at county jail level. But a felony in the state of California produces about 4,800 barriers for someone, meaning that if you have a felony on your record, you have 4,800 barriers to housing, employment, supportive services. A misdemeanor, because our jails are so overcrowded, folks often don't do a lot of time in our county jails for misdemeanors, but they still create an abundance of barriers. And so what we saw with Prop 47 is, yes, these 3 simple drug possession offenses you can no longer charge those as felonies, but in the last 2 years since it's been implemented, we've seen that has done very little to kind of shift people away from the criminal justice system, meaning that even after Prop 47 passed, even though these are felonies, a significant number of people for simple possessing of drugs are still getting filtered into the criminal justice system.
You mean in the jails, through misdemeanor?
Through misdemeanor, yes, in jails.
Yeah.
But
it's less time though.
It's less time, but our jails are, because of realignment, our jails are overcrowded, and we have people in our county jails serving long periods of time. Our jails weren't built for that. Our jails were max built for you to do a year in there, but we have people in there for 3, 10, 12 years. And I can tell you for LA County, we spend about $66,000 a year to have one person in there, and we spend less than $10,000 on a student through K through 12 programs.
Yeah. So I know you have a lot of ideas of just sort of like, okay, if not policing, then what? Then what are we going to do instead? So, but I want you to hold on to those ideas for when the group comes together, because I do want to get a policing voice in here. So thanks for right now. And let's welcome up Lolita Harper. She's the public relations spokesperson for the Sheriff's Employees Benefit Union here in San Bernardino, but she also was a detective at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department for many years. So she brings a variety of perspectives, and she's great because she, like me, believes having conversations about these issues is actually going to bring people together, right?
Absolutely.
This is like what we're really on the same page about, and among other things. So I brought you on third because I really did want you to have a chance to hear all of that and then be able to respond, right? And I know that, especially when it comes to lethal force, especially in these last couple of years, police have felt under attack on this issue. So I just want to, the first question I really want to get is just like, what do you wish people understood from your perspective on that issue?
I think that from a law enforcement perspective, we wish people would understand just what it's like to actually do the job. We have a lot of people that study what we do, they talk about what we do, they report on what we do, they look at statistics on what we do, but they don't do what we do. They go into neighborhoods for a couple hours at a time and then they leave them. They're not there on a regular basis. And just context. I think context is extremely important when you talk about law enforcement. 99% of all contacts end peacefully. That's a context that we seem to miss a lot in the media because the only things we hear about are the bad things. Intent. I don't know anybody that I worked with or that goes to work thinking that they want to harm somebody today. It's just, I don't know them. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but I mean, that is, again, with context. That's not what law enforcement officers are placed here to do. And I think that the narrative that's being spun, and I believe that it's unintentional, but it's still being spun, is that, cops have gone rogue and that they have no training, they have no restraint, and that they, they're doing their job and they're doing it to the best of their abilities in changing times. And, hindsight is always 20/20, but the legal standard for what an officer or a deputy does out in the field calls that hindsight isn't what you base that on. and that's legal. That's Graham versus Connor.
Yeah, I mean, the legal standard is if the officer's in fear for their lives or the lives of others, or of danger, any kind of danger, then they can shoot, right? That's the
Well, yeah, and I
That's
think
the
that's
legal
going to
standard.
be later in the conversation, but
Yeah.
there's also a legal standard just that Graham versus Connor brings into account. There's 4 things that you can't judge it on what you would do like a regular crime. It's actually, there's 4 standards for Graham versus Connor for law enforcement officers specifically, and one of them is that you can't look in hindsight.
in terms of like criminal prosecution,
Correct.
certainly, right?
Correct.
So, but in our case, I mean, I think I think that this is a valuable conversation. I'm so glad that you are part of it because I think in looking at these incidents and looking at the context that you're talking about in terms of how police interact with drug users, we can kind of see where the common ground is. Because I think you're right. I mean, I think that most people would agree that like nobody wants anybody to be shot, right?
Right.
Like we're actually all on the same page on this.
Yeah,
right?
and when Ms. Hernandez was speaking, I was nodding my head to a lot of things because I actually have the same points written in certain things. I think there's just a different way of going about
Right.
different methodologies for the same problem. We all see a problem. It's, how do we bring about the solutions?
Right, right. And so one of the points, brought up in this conversation is that, the reason that we're seeing this high rate of use of force, or one of the many reasons that we're seeing this high rate of use of force with people who show signs of substance use, is because police have a perception of who a drug user is, that they might be erratic, they might be unpredictable, or they might see them as a criminal element. I wanted to get your response to that. Do you think that that's a part of it, or do you think there's more at play?
I think that if you go off of the definition of what somebody who's under the influence, yes, of course, you're going to say they're not going to follow commands, they're going to be erratic, but I don't think it's fair to say that police have a perception. I would argue to say that as a deputy, I've probably come in contact with more drug users than anybody in this room, and I've had conversations with them.
I
I've
live in
talked
downtown LA.
Yeah, well, different kind of drug user. I've had conversations with them about their kids, about, the crime I'm there to investigate, about their domestic living situation. They've been victims, they've been suspects. It doesn't mean that every law enforcement officer has a perception about somebody that uses drugs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so and really we're kind of in this shifting context right now, right? Because the laws are changing. Aonesis was talking about how this was a step in the right direction to start decriminalizing drug use. But I've heard from people in law enforcement that it's actually complicating things. So how would you respond to sort of what's been happening with changing drug laws?
Well, when Aonesis was talking about AB 109 and Prop 47, those are things that in law enforcement we've also seen as extremely problematic. AB 109, again, shifted the responsibility of housing state prisoners down to the counties, which makes our county jails more full, which means that we're doing the state's job instead of holding the people that we should be holding. Prop 47, again, it decriminalized certain things. It decriminalized drug possession, and it also decriminalized a lot of the crimes that drug users use to support their habit, like identity theft and burglary and shoplifting, those kinds of things, nonviolent crimes. The problem with it is there's no longer an incentive for people to get help. The social...
You mean because it kind of decimated the drug court system?
Correct. I mean,
like, explain how that worked.
So Prop 36 was, the second Prop 36 was that there was an incentive to, it was incarceration or you could get help. And if you prove that you finished this drug court program, then you would not go to jail or not serve time. And so, I don't know if your dealings with people, with drug users in downtown LA is the same as my dealings with drug users.
They don't call me for crisis.
Right. So, when you have people that are deep in the throes of addiction, it's very hard for them to want to get help, or they want to get help, they don't know how to get help, or they can't get help, or the addiction is too much. So when there's no incentive or there's no drug court that they can go into, then they're left to do it alone, or they're left to try to find a place to go that's going to be free or something like that. So
Yeah, well, so the way it used to work, right, is that you would hold sort of, prison time, like a conviction over somebody's head, and say either get treatment or go behind bars. And now that it's a misdemeanor, right, there's not that carrot in the same way.
correct. Well, simple possession has always been a wobbler.
Yeah, you could-
It's rarely
Meaning it could be
prosecuted.
charged as a felony or misdemeanor.
Yeah, it's rarely prosecuted as just simple possession is rarely prosecuted as a felony. So there's no prison time attached to it, but there's county jail time that would be attached. And yeah, if they don't want to be locked up for 30 days or 3 months or whatever the sentence may be that came with their crime, then they were encouraged to go get treatment.
Yeah. So this changing context, do you think it's been good for police? I mean, you're saying you're saying there's no longer the carrot and the stick to get treatment. What are some of the other effects?
So I think that it's a mixed message that we're still sending. There is this problem, and it's substance abuse. It's no longer illegal, but there's not a lot of incentive to get help for it. People are calling 911 when they need help, and is it really that they need help? I mean, in the clip that you played of Miss Wan, the last thing that struck a chord to me was she said there was no emergency, yet she dialed 911. So when we have somebody calling us, it's an emergency. That's what 911 is about. So I think there's this middle land where if it's not an emergency, then why are police responding to it? If it is an emergency, then it should be treated as such. So I think everybody's in this middle ground right now where I think police are trying to catch up with the laws. Law enforcement is just that. We don't make the laws. We simply enforce them. So it's funny because I had in my notes the war on drugs, and I'm part of what I consider
What was in your notes for the war on drugs?
well, it was based on, I think it was going to be, the question I told might be answered was, do you think police are too aggressive on drug use?
Yeah.
And my answer to that was going to be, well, we don't make the laws. We enforce them. We grew up in the culture, I grew up in the culture of the war on drugs. I was a DARE child. I was taught in school. So things are changing, and I think that law enforcement will change with it, but I don't think we can be expected to lead that change. The laws have to change. We can't stop enforcing laws that still exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to back up on that point that you made a moment ago about, if somebody dials 911 and it police are called out, I mean, there's a myriad of options that police could take, right? I mean, not every situation ends in an arrest. So, are there, is there specific training or, what does an officer weigh or look for in being called out to those situations on sort of how to proceed?
There
Especially if drug
is
use is
training. We
involved,
get
yeah.
CIT training. It's crisis intervention training. We learn to see what the behavioral disorders are, and we learn about schizophrenia. We learn about, of course, drug use causes mental health problems, so those two go hand in hand. The thing that I think that people fail to understand is by the time that law enforcement gets called out, you're talking about caregivers, family members, oftentimes doctors, therapists, social workers, people who know these people closely that are at their wits' end, and that's when they call law enforcement. So if all the de-escalation tactics that they are trained to know, the doctors know, the therapists know, they're not working, that's when they call us. So what we have to deal with is what is happening in that instant. To take a step back, I don't mean to call the reporting into question, but I don't know what the 911 tape sounded like. I don't know what the call log
Oh,
looked
I wish I
like.
could have got that 911 tape. It's shielded from public view, so.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could have gotten it too, because was she screaming? Was she afraid? What was the context of it? I don't know those.
Well, my understanding, and this is what's in the police report too, is that her son was delusional and he was on drugs, and so they had some of that context, to sort of the the emotion that went along with that call, the drama that was conveyed to the dispatcher, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and I think when we were on the radio program together, there was mention that, you know, there's thousands of these calls and they end peacefully. I mean, she said herself, he was so empathetic, he was so understanding. You know, the deputy that was involved. Most of those do end peacefully. The difference is the actions of the suspect. I don't think it's fair that the difference is what the officer did or didn't do.
Okay, so we're gonna bring up the rest of the panelists. Thank you, and you can just stay here.
Okay.
So the other two panelists can come back and join us. I think you just really set the stage nicely, because we're gonna talk a little bit about you know, what is changing in the field of police work. I mean, it's, you know, we can't have a conversation around policy for how suspects should act, but we certainly can have a conversation around policy and how it's affecting police work and how that might create safe streets. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And so I'm sure Eunices has some thoughts on some of the stuff that Lolita brought up, specifically drug court. I'm sure you made a note about that. Do you? So the conversation was that, you know, without this carrot that was offered to people to get into treatment, that we're seeing less people seek treatment. Is that the case?
First, let's talk about what treatment means.
Okay.
Because we talk about treatment, we talk about people getting into treatment, but what a lot of folks fail to recognize, and I think that we don't know, is that there is no social safety net, and that there is really no type of treatment that people can go to.
I mean, there is treatment, right?
There is treatment.
Like, there is drug rehab.
There is drug rehab, but when, like, for example, LA County has a third of the population of the state, right? To get into drug treatment, you have to wait up to 4 to 6 weeks to get into a residential drug treatment bed. This is even after Prop 47 is passed. And so when we think about treatment, yeah, there is treatment, but there's hardly any beds. There's hardly any type of real resources. A lot of the resources out there are AA, you know, 12-step programs, not enough medicated assisted treatment, not treatment that is shown to work. And so, and especially in communities that don't have resources, like low-income communities, they don't really have access to doctors or psychiatrists, or even just the stigma around it. I know in the Latino community, there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and so that even prevents families from seeking help because they don't even want to recognize and acknowledge that their family member is suffering through something. And so there, a lot of times they don't really have access to treatment. But
the Affordable Care Act is changing that as well.
Yeah, but it's taken over a year to implement those fee waivers, and they're just starting to come out. So even if folks wanted to get into treatment now, there's still a long wait. Even in drug courts, even after Prop 47 passed, we've seen that there's been a decrease in numbers, but there's been no expansion in the treatment, and folks still have to wait, and they die waiting to get into treatment.
See, and I think this is where she and I would agree, because I agree that there should be social safety nets. Something between, if California wants to decriminalize this, then there's got to be another level between it not being legal or being legal and the police.
If not
there's got to be something else, right? Because we're getting called for things that are still illegal. There's no safety net, so we're seeing people that still have substance abuse problems. Their substance abuse problems go into more crime, so it's this vicious cycle. And I don't think law enforcement is opposed to having more social safety nets. I think that benefits everybody, and law enforcement included, because then we're not the ones that are being called for something like you alluded to that's better handled by somebody else.
Yeah, and I think a quote that you mentioned, it says, you know, we're doing our job. Folks don't know the job that we're doing. Like, they don't have no idea what's going on, and you're right. But there's also things that shouldn't have to be your job. There's things that should go into these other agencies that we've been talking about. And I think that until we recognize that and until we invest in that, then this is not going to change, because for over 40 years, we've been investing in this criminalization system, investing in law enforcement, investing in probation, but hardly any into developing a social safety net to begin to address these issues. And now California is, you know, applying all these reforms, and there's finally money going into building these infrastructures, but it's going to take time to build up those infrastructures to handle the population.
So I mean, to me, the next question is you know, what's law enforcement's role in that, right? Because as Lolita pointed out, police get called for these issues, right? That's who you call when there's a crisis. So what does that look like?
If I was dealing with a crisis like Ted's mom, I wish that if I could call 911, there would be some kind of crisis intervention agency to come out that deals with these types of mental health issues. I think that when you call law enforcement, it's in moments of like severe violence or, you know, victims. But when it's a situation like that, I think that there's different agencies that should be able to come out. And as a community member, when I call, I should be able to have that access. And that access doesn't exist.
You want to say something?
Yeah, and if I could interject, there actually, the Department of Mental Health has started a system partnering with law enforcement recently where and it's not at all departments and it's not at all police and sheriff's departments, but they do have mental health specialists who are at stations, and they do go out when they are called upon. It's a little hit and miss in that if the situation escalated to such a point to where it's not even safe for the specialist to be out there, then it's not going to help.
They're like clinicians, like
Exactly. One case in particular, which was late November, it happened in Rialto, where they have this test team, is what it's called. It's a test team. As 2 clinicians and an officer. They were called out to a home because a man was suicidal. He was threatening to kill himself, to kill family members, and he told his family members he wanted to be shot by the cops. So suicide by cop is what they had told him. So they go out there, and these clinicians, they have limited access to the files. If this person has gone through the Department of Mental Health, then they will have limited access to their files. Nothing that violates HIPAA, but just to say, hey, they've been here. This is the doctor who treated him. You know,
more
things like
information
that.
is better.
Exactly. So you have people who are better trained, and in that situation in particular, they were able to de-escalate it, and they were able to get him into treatment.
And nobody
He went
got
into
shot.
Arrowhead.
Yeah.
Right, and that's just one of the ones that I know. I sit there and I listen to the scanner all day, which you know.
Yeah.
And I've heard these teams called out, and I've heard them end peacefully. So they do have these around, and they've been around for a few years. I think San Bernardino City had the first one in the county, and they have had them for about 3 years, and it has expanded. And they're hoping to do more with them. They're hoping to be able to spread it out as needed, because the Department of Mental Health does realize that they need to have more out there, because there is the training that the deputies go through. But even with that training, they have other things that they have to be specialists in. And being a clinician, that just gives them that much more of an advantage, is you have somebody whose job it is to deal with these type of situations,
Right.
mental health and
And
drugs.
also, like when you talk about this example, like to me, it's such a shift, because if you bring in clinicians, right, suddenly the person is not a suspect. They're like a patient, or somebody who's in need of services, right?
And
which
there
is
wasn't
a
an arrest
different
there.
way to think about. And I'm not to say that that police haven't thought that way. So your thoughts on sort of building those bridges?
Well, I think the sheriff's department has been doing the CIT for deputy sheriffs. I was in the very first class. At that time, it was a 40-hour class. So it was a full week of it.
You were in the very first class.
I was in the very first class, yes. And that was when I was on patrol, so it had to be 2008, 2009. And so we've been learning how to do things differently. But the point I think that nobody is really grasping is, if you do have a clinician and somebody starts throwing something or wields a knife, law enforcement is still going to take the action that it needs to take, regardless of whether there's anybody there that says that this person has been diagnosed with this or this person has been diagnosed with that. Because in
But
that
there are
moment,
there are times when people are armed that just like Beatriz explained, that cops are able to use time and distance or somehow de-escalate it, right?
right,
I
but
mean,
it all depends on what's happening.
Right.
You can't you can't paint with a broad brush. Oh, well, this person was armed, this person wasn't armed. It depends on where they were pointing it, how their actions were, what they looked like, if they were being aggressive, what they were doing, it's totally different. You can't just cherry pick, well, this person had a knife, they could have had it down at their side. Everything depends on what happens in that instant.
I mean, don't you think that officers' training comes into play? Like if they've had de-escalation training, or if they've encountered these types of scenarios before? I mean, I imagine an officer's background training and experience, as the homicide commander at LA Sheriff's Department likes to say, has a huge impact on the decisions they make.
Well, of course, that's why we
Yeah.
train.
Yeah.
So we train in de-escalation theories. We train in being able to speak with people. We learn how to talk to people on numerous things. We learn how to talk to child abuse victims. We talk to people all the time. That's most of what we do is talk. But there are times when talking doesn't work.
Anisis, you've been exploring other ways in which the law enforcement's relationships with drug users could change. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in other cities that we may see in Southern California soon?
Sure. So in Seattle, Washington, there was an innovative program developed about 5 years ago called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And LEAD is pretty much, it's a pre-booking diversion program, meaning that at the time of arrest, an officer has the discretion to divert certain people into case management immediately. So for example, John, a law enforcement officer encounters John. John has drugs on him, he's intoxicated. He says, you know what, John, I can arrest you for this offense right now and I can book you like in a regular way, or I can take you to see a case manager right now and get your immediate needs met and get you enrolled into this program. And so what we've seen out of Seattle is that it's reduced recidivism in LEAD participants by 60%. And the offenses include small possession for sales of drugs, small sales of drugs, and then simple possession of drugs. And what we've seen is that the culture in law enforcement in Seattle has changed dramatically. I remember when I went to visit the program, there was an officer that they kept referring to in this meeting saying, yeah, Chad, Officer Chad referred this person, Officer Chad referred that person. And when I expected Chad to walk in, I expected someone who was like, looked welcoming, personable. But when Chad walked in, he was strapped on his thigh. He looked like a G.I. Joe, army person. But he got the program, and he recognized that incarcerating these people over and over again for drugs hadn't done anything for his community. And so he has been taking full advantage of the LEAD program. And in California last year, our organization was able, through a budget trailer bill, secure $15 million to implement LEAD pilots in the state of California. This year, those $15 million are being dispersed to 2 counties, Los Angeles County and San Francisco County, to begin the implementation of LEAD programs. And so in LA County, we're working with LAPD, we're working with the Long Beach Police Department and LA County Sheriff's Department to implement a LEAD program in the Long Beach corridor, meaning that folks who police encounter that are intoxicated, for example, maybe they encounter them selling small amounts of drugs or possession for sales for small amounts of drugs. If this person is known to have gone through the criminal justice system several times or is selling to sustain their habit or themselves, they could be potential LEAD clients.
So what kind of services are you talking about? Like, we'll get you with a social worker immediately. Like, what do you mean?
We're talking about immediate needs: shoes, food, a hotel voucher. Long-term services are permanent housing, employment services. Pretty much the case manager can get the person any type of service that they need to move forward. But it's one of the things about LEAD is that it's a harm reduction based program. You talked a little bit about, there's a hammer and then there's a carrot, and this is what's been going on. We know that the carrot and the hammer have not worked. And in LEAD, there is no carrot and there is no hammer. So the only thing that a person has to do is get enrolled in the program. Even if the person continues to use drugs, it's a harm reduction based program. So recognizing that this person is not going to cessate their drug use in one session, and so understand that they'll continue to use, kind of helps the police humanize the individual, and recognizing that it's going to take more than this forced treatment to get them to be better.
Yeah, and Beatriz, in some of your reporting too, you've talked to the San Bernardino County Sheriff, and some of what you found was that when police are paying less attention to arresting drug users, they have resources for other things.
Right. We sat down with the San Bernardino County Sheriff, Sheriff McMahon, and what he told us early in the year is that he shifted priorities from the street level drugs to other crimes, gang crimes, homicides, human trafficking was a big one that now is getting a lot more push. That doesn't mean that they are ignoring drug crimes.
Yeah.
It just means that the drug crimes are now falling on the patrol officers. So the patrol officers are now handling the drug crimes, and because of Prop 47, now those MET teams, is it the major enforcement teams? Now
There's different teams in narcotics.
Okay, the narcotics teams, they are focusing more on these higher level, mostly gang related crimes. As a matter of fact, I think it was late last year, there was a big press conference because this particular team, along with the San Bernardino PD, they were able to focus their efforts, and they made several arrests. I want to say it was in the 40s, and they helped clear 4 homicides. That was with the help of shifting that priority to these higher level crimes.
So we're going to do some audience questions here in a moment. So you can, if you guys have a question, I really encourage you to ask a question. You can line up over there. And yeah, so please start lining up. Yep. Mm-hmm. And while people are getting their thoughts together on this, Lolita, I mean, just your response to some of these ideas of how the changing relationship between police and drug users.
Well, I obviously can't speak for the sheriff's department,
Right.
and I think in this instance, I really can't even speak for my organization, but when I'm hearing, you know, something like lead being described, I can't imagine that it wouldn't be welcomed. I mean, we, like I said before, we are law enforcement, so we enforce the laws. If the legislature and the lawmakers are gonna change the laws, then we will change with it. You know, I think that there needs to be something else though. If those are gonna change, then there's gotta be other, you know, a lead program would be great then to get people into treatment. I think the
You mean there needs
problem-
to be some kind of avenue of
Yes, there needs to be some kind of avenue to help the addiction, because the addiction's not gonna go away if it's legal or illegal. And I know in higher socioeconomic areas, there's people that can get the help, or they can still function. They don't have to prostitute themselves to get their fix. In lower socioeconomic areas, you see girls that are on the streets, they're being pimped, they're being pandered, they're having sex for money so that they can get their addiction fixed. These are the crimes and the social ills that we see with addiction, whether it's legal or illegal. There needs to be an avenue for people to get treatment if they want it.
Okay. All right, let's take the first question.
First of all, Jay Lindbergh, I'm an author of a book about 10 years ago, Drug War Economics, The Machine Behind the Madness. And I spoke yesterday at the Board of Supervisors about the role of criminal informants and some of the crimes that they have on their records. One of them in particular was this guy had 4 felonies and misdemeanors, beating on his wife, convictions, bomb, arson, and of course methamphetamine manufacturing. And they scrubbed his record so they could use him as an informant. Now, you know, it's like somebody's got to start addressing the problems with the criminal informants out there. I've seen the role of these guys, and I think that the role of these guys are far more dangerous than the actual addicts on the streets, because these people really are above the law. And has anyone even looked at that?
No? Not when we're dealing with the subject matter that we're dealing with here. That could be something maybe that we would want to look into in the future, but not in our reporting. I did not come across criminal informants.
There have been some reports that have come out around informants, but about how informants are being killed in the process of giving information. So there have been reports around that and giving information around drug cases in the media. So if you want to Google. Well, they're criminal informants. Well, no, it's
So I mean, so one of the questions that raises to me is, we know that drug possession charges used to be a lever for detectives and people doing police work. I mean, even with the gangs, investigations as well. And the idea was, if you hold charges over someone, then you have a little bit more leverage to get them to cooperate or get them to help you on a case. Do you see that that's changing, or do you disagree with this characterization?
Well, no, I think what he's talking about is more the informants that are signed up, that are used by narcotics divisions to go and get the big ones. And everybody's probably wondering why I'm quiet on this. Because I don't speak for the department, I don't feel comfortable talking about those roles or how they're used or the uses behind them. But I will say that, of course, it brings open the debate on what do you look past to get the bigger fish. I think if I'm wrong, then correct me, but I believe that's what you're alluding to.
I think we should talk after, because maybe it's a different reporting topic altogether. And okay, let's talk after. Let's do the next question.
Hi there. My name is Luis Lozano. I'm a student here at CSUSB, and my question is for Ms. Harper. I'd like to start by saying thank you for your service. And my question, I'm going to read off of here. So you say that the problem is, or there's not a problem with the perception of officers towards drug users, but you also say that in modern policing culture is shaped by the tough on crime laws of the past, and you gave your uprising in the DARE programs and whatnot as a flag for that. But my question is to ask you how you think we should change the laws to make it less tough on crime, given that you've already criticized the proposition that that was easy on crime law.
You mean Prop 47, the
Yeah.
changes in the drug laws?
Was that? It was either Assembly Bill or Prop 47, the one that reduced the felonies and misdemeanors.
Okay.
That was Prop 47.
Prop 47, yeah.
Okay, so I believe your question is, what do I think, how do I think the laws should change? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Am I summarizing that correctly?
Basically, yeah.
Okay. I think you alluded to a couple of things, which I was saying, I don't think that law enforcement in general has a perception of a drug user. Now, there may be some that do. I did say I grew up in DARE and that kind of stuff, and Nancy Reagan, I remember being in, you're too young for this, but I remember being in grade school and, the war on crime and all that stuff. I think what changed was when I actually got in the field and I started to interact with drug users. Like I said, they were my suspects, they were my victims, they were my mothers, they were my fathers, they were, the kids that I went on child abuse cases, their parents had drug abuse problems, all of that interacted. So I think the only reason I kind of bristled at that perception thing is that I think when you get into the communities, and talk to people, you don't necessarily go, oh, that's a doper, that's a user. You can look at the signs and the symptoms and you can see if somebody's using. I can still see that now, even though I'm retired. I don't think I have an opinion on where the law should go. I think that if they go in the current direction, then there needs to be a buffer zone between what the state wants to see from legalization of drugs or softer on crime. What do they want? How do they expect public safety to ensue when there's no longer laws to enforce? Because
so the answer is not to do nothing, right?
Well, I mean, we're law enforcement. So if you're taking away the laws, then who enforces the behavior? you know? Or how does that work? What happens to addiction? Where does that go?
What do you think? So with this changing context, my follow-up question to that is just, what do police need to do their work? Like, a step down from recommending what the law should be. Like, what do police need, or what did you need?
Well, I mean, when I was on patrol, I still had, Prop 47 wasn't in.
Right.
When I was a detective, it was, and it was frustrating. It really was, because I think so much of this conversation is centered around the user, which I agree is also, needs their own services, but you have to remember the victims in these people's path. I was doing cases on identity theft, burglary, women that were afraid to go back into their house, kids that were shaken up because their room had been ransacked, their piggy banks had been broken. This is all because, I can't say for certain, but most of these property crimes are done to fuel drug addictions. They have a habit, they need to buy their stuff, or they're pawning people's things off. So, in my mind, it's not just about the user, the person that has the problem with the addiction. It's the victims that they leave in their wake. That's, I think, where my heart goes out to more. So I think what we need is, I think if the legislature is going to change how they want drug use to be seen, then there has to be something that's not law enforcement that helps with addiction.
Okay, let's do the next question.
Hello, I'm Marisol Torres. Thank you all for being here in this very important forum. I think actually you kind of said it perfectly at the end, that there should be, if laws are going to change, what else can be there other than law enforcement? And I think something I've been hearing from all of you has been the need to have some kind of social net and have something for these people outside of just having to call 911 for non-emergencies or things like that. So my question is related to realignment, and particularly, again, from moving them from state to county level. And some of those funds also do come to the county, and so I'm just wondering, how are those funds used in San Bernardino County that kind of go with that idea of not necessarily focus only on law enforcement, but providing these social nets, providing these services for individuals that need help outside of just policing?
How's that money being used, Beatrice? Do you know?
So I did a lot of work back in 2010, doing a lot of research on realignment, and actually talking to people and explaining to them that what it did and what it didn't do. One of the problems with AB 109 was that, yes, the counties got the funding, but there really wasn't there weren't guidelines. They just said, okay, here's the money.
And this was money that was coming from the state level, because we used to incarcerate so many at the state level.
Exactly.
And then it all kind of moved down to counties, because they were.
So it came down to the counties.
Yeah, so.
Now, having covered not just San Bernardino County, but also LA County, I was over at a sister paper in Long Beach. I actually saw the differences between how the counties did it. And it was night and day between San Bernardino and LA County. I remember as it was rolling out, I was talking to probation, and months beforehand, they were trying to hire new probation officers and trying to get.
And this was which county?
San Bernardino.
Okay.
Here in San Bernardino County. They were trying to hire more probation officers. They were trying to open more locations where you could check in. They were reaching out to community faith-based programs in order to be able to refer them, because there was no way that they would be able to just in-house be able to do it. So they were doing that. They were reaching out. Now, I haven't reported on it in a couple of years, but I know that's where the money went initially. The money went to hiring more probation officers, trying to expand the programs. They were partnering with a lot of local resources, mostly the faith-based and the community organizations where people could go and get treatment. In LA County, I think it was a little different. Just one of the big
Well, go ahead, because
Eunice
LA
was supposed
County.
to say how the money
Yeah.
was spent. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in LA County, I've been doing a lot of research on the AB 109 fund because we have a campaign called Reimagine 109. Because for the last 5 years in LA County, over 80% every year has gone into law enforcement and supervision, and less than 20% has gone into community-based or county agency programs. Even after Prop 47, when our population of AB 109 dropped by 50%, both under supervision and incarceration, the flow of money never changed. We saw that the year after, again, it went back to the sheriffs. But similarly to San Bernardino, a lot of the counties in the state, because there was no mandate on how they should spend that money, a lot of the counties have decided we're going to fund law enforcement and supervision over these services. But counties like Alameda County, Contra Costa County up north, they've actually diverted most of their funds into developing these community-based services. But unfortunately down here, that's not what it looks like at all.
I think Lolita wants to weigh in on that.
Well, I was just going to say that when 2010 was the most money that the counties received. Every year after, the state has given less and less and less money. I think that there's obviously more than one perspective to all of this, but the money was supposed to be what the state was saving by not incarcerating these inmates, and it was supposed to be given to incarcerate these inmates. I mean, that's one perspective. Obviously, there's differences of opinion where the money should go, but when there's less and less being given by the state and the jails are more and more full, you alluded to it earlier, we have people that are serving time in our county jails, which were initially built to house people up to a year. Either you're pre-sentenced, which means you're waiting for your trial, so some murder suspects could be there for years, but that's not, generally the case, or you're there for up to a year. Now we have people that, I think the last time I checked, we had somebody serving an 18-year sentence. So you're compounding this space in there, but the state is giving less and less money. So there's less money to go around, basically. And the way that law enforcement sees it, at least, and of course it's up for discussion, that's why we're here, is that that money was initially given to ensure that these violent people remain behind bars. And so
It's not all violent people, right?
Yeah, it's actually the non-nons, which are the non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual offenders, which that population is almost all drug offenses.
Which is a misnomer, however, because you're only looking at the triple non for their last offense. And if you notice, in 2010, there was a spike in 10851, which is stealing cars, because people knew, word got out on the street, that if your last offense was a property crime, you would be considered a triple non. So you could have rape, you could have assault with a deadly weapon, you could have all those things in your criminal background, but because your last offense was a triple non, you were considered a non-violent offender, which I think is deceitful.
Let's get to these last couple questions.
Hi, my name's Axel. I have a couple observations and a question. Also, thank you for your service, and also thanks for San Bernardino County and all that they've done. One observation as far as how the community perceives police officers or police in general is that, or at least when it comes to fatal shootings, etc., is that any of these crimes that get committed during these encounters, it's tough for the communities to accept them, only because not in any of our laws does it say that any of these crimes should be prosecuted by death. So it makes it hurts the communities a lot when they have loved ones, etc., that basically lose their lives over what seems like infractions that shouldn't be punished by death. Second is that as far as people that have police called upon them, that it's tough maybe for them to cooperate, etc., because most of us see the police as only a threat in terms of our freedoms, and that without programs like LEAD, etc., it's hard for the communities to see police as somebody that can help them, even though they may be the ones, or people are calling on the police on themselves. So, and then the last question, or my question, is about the state of Utah, in that they've been recently getting a decent amount of press as to the retraining that they've done for their officers, and if you guys knew anything about that, and how they're able to implement that training.
Does anybody know anything about Utah? I sure don't. But let's talk about training. So have policemen changing training at all that any of you have seen in terms of recognizing substance use and dealing with people that may be in crisis?
Well, I mean, again, we go back to our crisis intervention training, which is implemented for every single deputy.
Do you recognize substance use as part of that training?
Well, recognize substance use as part of regular academy, and then just like any other profession, I mean, training is mandated in our profession, and because laws are constantly changing, not just how we're talking about here, but interpretation of laws. I mean, society is changing, people are changing. Law enforcement values education. You know, deputies go to numerous trainings on various things. So I think training is always evolutionary. Now, in terms of whether it's a department sanction or a department-wide training, then that's something.
Do you think it's enough training? Do you think that Eunices has an opinion. She gave me a face.
No, I don't think there has been enough training. And I think that we can even look at it when law enforcement speaks. Because when we talk about some of these issues, we talk about the drug addicts, the drug users, the prostitutes. We don't ever humanize these individuals. So when we talk about these issues, it has to go back to the fundamental level of recognizing a person and recognizing that they're human. So moving forward, I think that it goes to the basics. When you're going to talk about people who use substances, it's a person who uses substances. Or if a person is engaging in sex work, it's a person involved in sex work. We don't like to use the word addiction because there's a lot of stigma around it, but we do use problematic substance use. And if folks have problematic substance use, we say that individual has problematic substance use, or that person has a mental illness. And so I think that when we think about training, it has to go back just to the fundamental level, even of thinking how law enforcement perceives the community that they're serving.
Well, I mean, I, of course, respect your opinion, and I'm sure it's based on, your point of view or the research or the people that you've come in contact with. But I know when I was on patrol, just a really quick story, the reason I chose San Bernardino County was because I was a reporter before I actually went to journalism school.
That's another thing I like about her. Yeah.
And I came out to San Bernardino County, and I did a ride-along as part of my job for the Sun, which is now where Beatriz works. And I remember riding with this detective, or I think at the time he was still a deputy, and I had done numerous ride-alongs in Orange County, Burbank, other places. And the way he talked to this guy, I had always been toying about going into law enforcement, and I said, this is where I'm going to go, because he is talking to this person like a person. So I don't know. I don't think you can classify everybody.
So you're saying that's always been police work, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying always. I don't think you can do anything with a broad-based brush. I can tell you that most of the people I arrested were literally saying thank you, because I talked to them, I listened to them, whether it was substance abuse or whether it was domestic violence or something else. We would talk about their kids. I didn't look at them. I can speak for myself. I can speak for the people that I worked with closely. I can't speak for everybody, but I don't think that that's a fair generalization to make about every officer, and I don't think it's fair to say there's not enough training. When I used to instruct at the academy, we told people, you treat everybody like they're your grandma until they give you a reason not to. We talk about cultural diversity. We talk about not profiling. We talk about all this stuff. Do people choose to ignore it? Yes, that's everybody's individual prerogative, but is everybody a certain way? Is every law enforcement officer only stigmatizing people? That's flat out
no. I don't think anybody thinks that. Yeah, I think it's.
Well, I think when we're talking about is the training enough and all that stuff, I mean, there's still, everybody's going to go about their job differently. You can get taught how to report on a story, but you might talk to somebody differently or do your job differently. It doesn't mean you were trained wrong. It just means you do things differently.
Yeah. Any final thoughts from either of you guys? Or Lolita?
No, but actually,
Go ahead.
I think just
whatever you've been meaning to say that I never asked. Just
I think that when we do think about training, I think that there's still some components that we could add on, specifically around harm reduction, around drug users. Not a lot of law enforcement agencies that I've had interactions with have been trained in the idea of harm reduction, the acknowledging that folks will.
What do you mean by harm reduction?
So harm reduction is the concept of meeting someone where you're at, where they're at. It's reducing the harms of substance use. We know people are going to use, so let's open clean needle exchange programs. We know people are going to use, let's open up programs where they can get, new drug using tools to prevent the spread of HIV, hepatitis, things like that. But it also encompasses the idea that we know that folks are going to continue their drug use until they want to cessate. And by forcing them or coercing them, that's not going to work. And in LA County, what we're doing around LEAD is that we're training the sheriffs and Long Beach Police Department on what harm reduction is, for them to recognize what problematic substance use looks like, and training them to recognize that this individual that they dealt with is not going to go away, so they're probably going to see them in the street the next day, but that they're in some type of service, and they're on the path to getting better. But it's not going to happen overnight, and they won't have to only rely on the tool of a punitive policy or the hammer of incarceration.
Yeah. Beatrice?
I think one of the things that I walked away with from doing this reporting and talking about drug addiction, and I think it was Ioannis who said this, is that, or maybe it was you, is this overlap of mental health and drugs. In talking to the Department of Behavioral Health, I think the statistic is that 20% of people who go in for mental health services have some sort of drug abuse issue. But 60% of people with drug abuse issues have a mental health issue as well. So it's intertwined. So there does have to be a change in the way that people are treated, how they are offered help. One other thing about it is that when the Affordable Care Act came into play, a lot more people were able to go and get that help. Once again, it was up to them. They went if they wanted to. And here in the county, they did see an uptick in people signing up for that. And they were servicing them. They had caseworkers. I don't exactly know how burned in that system is. Right now, what they've been talking about is they don't know what's going to happen in the coming years because the state of healthcare is so in flux right now. So you may have people who will end up back on the streets and unfortunately will have to be dealt with by law enforcement.
Yeah. And or just, more of the responsibility flows from the federal government down to the local level.
Right.
Any last thoughts, Lolita, or you good?
Just especially for the people that came up and said thank you for your service. I mean, that means a lot. I think that San Bernardino County law enforcement has a very special bond with its community because of the tragedies that we've seen. And I think we've seen that even if there's difference of opinion or whatever, there's a mutual respect there. And I think that people in the law enforcement community feel that and are grateful for that. And of course, if there's difference of opinion, that's also good. It's healthy. It's good to have discussions and hear differing points of view. So I just want to thank you for inviting me. And a lot of what we've heard is to not stigmatize and to be inclusive. And I think that in a little bit of a way, I would ask that people don't do that towards law enforcement. We are people with histories and backgrounds and families that may or may not have substance abuse problems. And we see a lot, and we care. That's why we do it, So I just thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no broad brush. Okay, well, thanks for having this conversation, guys. And thanks so much for coming out.